segnata dal destino, batte il cielo della nostra patria. L'ora delle decisioni irrevocabili. La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori.
Benito Mussolini, the ruthless Italian dictator, had a clear goal: to rebuild the Roman Empire. And he was not prepared to let anything or anyone stop him. Anyone who stood in his way would pay for it in blood. Violence and fear were his main weapons in his rise to power, promising peace to a people who would soon be sunk in the shadows. Repression was the answer to complaints about hunger and working conditions, and censorship became the only way to survive the brutality of the Blackshirts. In this new military history video, we will delve into the fascist Italy of the fearsome Deuce to learn what life was like for people during that implacable regime. Join us to discover the cruelty of the man who gave his opponents the choice between two words: silence or death.
Entre 1919 y 1925, Mussolini prometió muchas cosas a su pueblo: estabilidad política, orden público, prosperidad, reformas sociales y un imperio. Italia quiere paz, tranquilidad y trabajo. Yo le daré todo esto, si puedo, con amor y si es preciso, por la fuerza.
Benito Mussolini's reign of authoritarianism and systematic oppression took its first steps in 1919. Italy was in chaos, still reeling from the wounds of World War I. Economic crisis and political instability were rife, while the divided and desperate population cried out for change. It was in this context that the figure of a leader as charismatic as he was manipulative emerged, who would not hesitate to use tactics of terror and violence to get what he wanted. Mussolini was a former socialist who reinvented himself when he was expelled from the party for supporting the war. In this way, he became the main defender of a new and aggressive ideology: fascism. He founded the movement known as Fascisti Italiani di Combattimento, a coalition of former soldiers, ultranationalists, and sectors of the working class dissatisfied with the country's present. He promised to restore Italian greatness through a regime of order and discipline. While his bravura speeches won him support from the disillusioned masses, the movement also gained strength from its brutal methods. The Blackshirts, as the fascist paramilitary squads were known, were deployed throughout the nation, violently attacking opponents, especially socialists and communists. Beatings, arson, murder. Nothing was too much. Thus, through coercion and terror, fascism permeated the Italian social and political fabric.
En Italia, los camisas negras eran los miembros fundamentales del partido y constituían un ejército especial, un ejército del partido. En realidad, no había habido en la generación anterior, en toda Europa, ningún tipo de movimiento político similar a aquel.
These soldiers of terror of Mussolini were the executioners of Italy and the precursors of an iron regime. They were the executors of a ruthless violence that left indelible marks in every corner of the nation. They had been born in the shadows of the chaos that followed the First World War, as they were often ex-combatants of that conflict. To infuse the movement with greater violence, there were also young people with no future and criminals among their members. They too found in fascism a cause and an identity. The name of this bloodthirsty army came from their clothing, as they wore black shirts, completed their outfits with clubs, pistols, and knives. They made up a beastly troop that patrolled the streets. Determined to crush any hint of dissent, this fascist terror machine was implacable. Their loyalty to Mussolini was total, and members acted as if they were immune to the laws, knowing that any act of violence they committed would be justified in the name of the good of the fatherland. As the Duce's power grew, so did the ferocity of these squads. They burned down socialist printing presses, stormed union headquarters, and attacked opposition newspapers. Their message was clear: there would be no place for dissenting voices under the shadow of fascism. One of their favorite tactics was the spedizione punitiva, or punitive expedition, a hunt for opponents in which the Blackshirts surrounded entire villages, capturing and torturing anyone who had defied the regime's orders. In these raids, batons and chains were tools of persuasion, while the screams of their victims became the ominous music of their achievements. For those who were dragged out in the middle of the night, the fate that awaited them was hellish. They were beaten in public and often left dying on the outskirts of towns, being used as a message to others. Physical violence was not the Blackshirts' only resource. They also used psychological fear to break the spirit of their enemies. On many occasions, they humiliated their victims in front of their families, stripping them of their clothes, cutting off their hair and forcing them to march naked through the streets, marked with written insults. The idea was to reduce their prey to the level of animals, destroying not only their body but their dignity until they were reduced to broken shadows. From peasants and workers, the Blackshirts demanded total loyalty, forcing them to swear allegiance to fascism in exchange for the safety of their loved ones. Those who resisted were brutally beaten or sent to concentration camps on the Italian islands, places where the regime made sure that enemies of the state suffered in inhuman conditions. In this way, the party gained enormous support, not out of conviction but out of terror.
El éxito fascista en la Italia rural tuvo unas consecuencias terribles. A finales de 1921 el partido había aumentado de 20.000 miembros a más de 200.000. Además también saboreó el éxito electoral. 38 fascistas, incluido Mussolini, fueron elegidos para el Parlamento. Sorprendentemente, el apoyo fascista estaba bastante extendido.
In 1922, Mussolini took advantage of the crisis that gripped the country, plunged into fear to strike the final blow. He organized the March on Rome, a display of force by thousands of Blackshirts who advanced towards the capital demanding power. Terrified, King Victor Emmanuel III did not dare to stop them and, instead of resisting, appointed Benito Mussolini as prime minister. From that moment on, fascism would begin to consolidate itself as a totalitarian regime. Once in that position, the Duce left nothing to chance. The new government used propaganda to exalt his image as an infallible leader, the savior of Italy. Meanwhile, his ruthless men suppressed any contrary opinion. For those who dared to challenge the system, the response was brutal. Intellectuals, activists, and opponents were arrested, and in many cases, disappeared. Oppression grew by the minute.
El 4 de enero de 1925 es el momento revelador con el que el fascismo se embarca en el camino hacia la dictadura y hacia el Estado totalitario. Lo hace a través de una serie de leyes que eliminan del Parlamento a los diputados de la oposición, leyes que censuran cada vez más la prensa y que, en último lugar, en 1926, llevan a la disolución de los partidos no fascistas y de los sindicatos no fascistas. Dos grandes estructuras que se instauran son el Estado policial y el Estado de partido único. El Vaticano, igual que la monarquía, mantuvo el silencio.
Strikes were punished with violence. Workers and peasants who had once believed in Mussolini's promises found themselves enslaved under a system that demanded absolute loyalty to the state and forcefully repressed any attempt at protest. Italians were forced to join fascist unions, which functioned more as tools of control than as true defenders of labor rights. Working conditions worsened and hours increased, while pay barely covered basic needs. For many people, the workday was an experience of constant surveillance, where every word and gesture was observed. Supervisors, usually fervent followers of fascism, did not hesitate to report employees who showed signs of dissent, condemning them to unemployment or worse. To make matters worse, the economic environment was tense and restrictive. Poverty was a constant, especially in rural areas, where peasants faced high taxes and low wages. The vast majority lived in poverty, struggling to feed their families. Even access to basic goods was limited. The regime encouraged rationing and austerity in the name of national sacrifice, while the fascist elite lived in opulence.
People, they were a lot poor. We didn't have nothing. My mother was a dressmaker and a tailor. You see, there was no material to sew, no thread to sew. So we resourced on other things. We used to make bread and sell the bread, but there is no money involved. You give the bread, they give you sugar. If they don't have sugar, they give you honey, anything. There was no money was exchanging it.
These harsh conditions were part of everyday life for the Italian people, who were surrounded by fascist symbols from dawn onwards. The streets were filled with posters with Mussolini's face and slogans recalling the omnipotence of the state and the severity with which its enemies were treated. The media were carefully controlled, and all information was filtered to transmit only what benefited the regime. Listening to a foreign radio station or possessing unapproved reading material was a crime that could lead to arrest. People therefore lived in a suffocating bubble, with no possible escape from the words and images that glorified the douche and demonized his rivals. This caused Italians to practice self-censorship, even in their own homes. The walls seemed to have ears. Neighbors, forced or convinced by propaganda, could betray even the slightest sign of dissatisfaction with the regime. Many families adopted a paranoid caution, speaking in whispers and avoiding political topics in the presence of strangers, but also in front of their own children. There were cases where children indoctrinated in schools denounced their parents for criticizing fascism.
Se obligaba a los niños a creer, obedecer, luchar. Desde los 4 años se les presionaba para apuntarse a las juventudes fascistas que les proporcionaban armas de juguete y camisas negras.
Duce, duce, chiamaci.
Duce, duce, chiamaci.
La voce degli eroi.
Los poemas de los colegios enseñaban a los niños a estar listos para luchar por el fascismo cada vez que su líder los necesitara.
For children and young people, life was marked by indoctrination in the values imposed by Mussolini. From an early age, they were taught unconditional loyalty to the state, and they were prepared to serve in the army or in fascist bodies. Education, far from being a free learning process, became a means of control. Textbooks glorified the exploits of the douche, and any subject that might encourage critical thinking was censored. Thus, an entire generation grew up under a system that taught them to idolize their leader and despise anyone who opposed their ideas of forming an empire. That was Mussolini's great goal, to equal ancient Rome. But he knew that to do so, the country had to grow and modernize. There was an increase in the generation of work, although this did not mean that the conditions were decent. On the contrary, the money would be invested in improving military power.
Los fascistas introdujeron una política de autosuficiencia en agricultura e industria. Unas impresionantes obras públicas fascistas para drenar pantanos y construir carreteras crearon muchos puestos de trabajo y eran inmensamente populares. Pero para Mussolini, su principal objetivo era preparar a la economía italiana para la guerra.
In his unbridled ambition, Mussolini also began to forge alliances with another shadowy figure in Europe, Adolf Hitler. They shared ideals of extreme nationalism, racism, and militarism. Together, they aspired to redraw the European map. In 1940, the Duca dragged Italy into World War II, convinced that by joining Nazi Germany, he would usher in a new imperial era for the country. Still, making deals with such a controversial figure as the Führer raised concerns among Italians, including Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano.
¿Será suficiente la solidaridad de los regímenes para mantener juntas a dos naciones cuyas razas, culturas, religiones y gustos son totalmente opuestos?
Pero incluso Ciano sabía que no había alternativa a los nazis si Italia quería retar el poder de Gran Bretaña y Francia.
Mussolini was aware that moving closer to German power represented the best opportunity to achieve his goal quickly. He was confident that the ultra-nationalist line of thought shared by his regime and the Third Reich would foster lasting and beneficial ties. For this reason, he wanted to deepen those similarities by taking new measures for his nation.
Los italianos deben aprender a ser menos compasivos para convertirse en duros, implacables y agresivos. Ambos.
Mussolini intentó impresionar a Hitler declarando que los italianos eran arios como los alemanes. Los judíos pasaron a ser una raza inferior.
Laws were passed, depriving the entire Jewish community of voting and representation. Jewish officials were expelled from public office, and even Jewish children were expelled from schools. Mussolini's ideas were successful, and the alliance with the Nazis was strengthened. However, the end result was not what he had hoped for. Italy failed to rebuild the Roman Empire. On the contrary, the war plunged the country into unprecedented devastation. The nation's forces, ill-prepared and inadequately supported, suffered humiliating defeats. On the home front, Allied bombing and Nazi occupation devastated entire cities. The people, already beaten down by years of fascist oppression, now lived under the terror of war. Finally, in 1943, faced with the collapse of local troops and pressure from the Allies, the Grand Fascist Council dismissed Mussolini. But the damage had already been done. Italy was destroyed, in ruins. On April 28, 1945, the Duce was shot by communist partisans while trying to flee the country. Beyond his death, his regime left a deep and painful mark on the history of the nation. Living in fascist Italy was like living in an open-air prison. People faced constant fear and moral anguish that seeped into every aspect of their existence. Every day they were forced to remain silent, to feign loyalty, and to hide any emotion that might betray their true thoughts. The Duce's promise to restore greatness to Italy only brought oppression, violence, and misery. And now, after having experienced the brutal life under Benito Mussolini's regime, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We look forward to meeting you again in the next military history video.